Laura, welcome to this joint Derby Book Festival and Buxton International Festival event. The link here is partly me because I invited you to both festivals, but clearly the link here is Derbyshire. And so I'd like to start at really the end of the book, and our grand dame of Derbyshire, Debo, the late Dowager Duchess of Devonshire, who you, I know, spoke to personally. Tell us about that experience.
Oh, amazing. Oh, she was everything that I hoped she would be. I went to Chatsworth pretty nervous, but less nervous because I'd already done Diana, and that was the one I was really nervous about. And that was an experience, my goodness, something I sort of think about every week of my life. So Debo after that was, because obviously she hadn't been quite so friendly with Hitler and all those things. So I went up to Chatsworth and she was in a kind of anteroom with her feet up on, the anteroom was twice the size of my flat. And this brilliant old dog on the floor and this very Mitfordian relaxation, grandeur that nonetheless makes itself accessible to you in some way, which is the whole Mitford thing. They package up our notions of the aristocracy and offer them to us in a form that we can't get enough of. And she talked, I remember her showing me Nancy's writing notebooks, which was rather thrilling. She was Nancy's literary executrix. And she sort of talked, I remember she said to me, because I adore Nancy, and I think Nancy had a fantastic life, but Deborah and Diana were at great pains to tell me that Nancy had a terrible life because she didn't have a happy love life and she didn't have any children. Deborah said to me, proper husband, proper children, that's what any woman needs. I'm sorry, I'm a total female. And I was, quite young and a bit kind of about that, and I still don't have a proper husband or proper children, but I've never forgotten her saying it, and it's a kind of femininity that I don't subscribe to particularly myself, but you can't but fall at the feet of people that sure of themselves. And I remember she was talking, because I'm terribly into horse racing, she said something about one of her husband's horses. I said, and I remembered the name. She said, oh, you are clever. That Mitford, because it wasn't clever at all. So she was gorgeous. And this was, when was this? 2003. So she was still very vigorous. 83, which is nothing from Mitford. And that was for my book about Nancy, which I wrote, which is coming out again this year. And I also wrote a group biography of the Mitfords. So I'm pretty Mitforded up, but it all began with Nancy, really. Although I think she'd have been pretty scary to meet.
To come back to the beginning of the book, which we're talking about, Take Six Girls, you are a fearless writer. You root everything back to the present day, which actually is quite tough to do, but you do it effortlessly. And I'm trying to think of an example where you suggest that Jessica, were she alive today, would use Instagram. And I completely believe the rationale that you gave for that. And you do root things back to the present so that you understand the myth of the Mitfords as a kind of how you could lead your life according to the Mitfords in the present day. You have this lovely phrase, you have this lovely sentence, which it's about confidence. And you say, this confidence of theirs, relaxed, diamond hard, is fascinating. A kind of confidence that for all their greater freedom, today's women do not find easy to possess. And that idea does actually run across a couple of your books. Can you elaborate on that for us?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, it's an opinion, obviously, and thank you for your lovely words. I mean, but I did think that the only way, because I was asked to write this book, to write about the Mitfords again, it's like Henry VIII's 6 wives, isn't it? Nazi fascism, was to re-examine, go revisionist. Why are we still so fascinated when they represent so much that we do not hold dear? You know, privilege, extremist politics, to say the least, etc., snobbery, blah, blah. So I tried to examine, re-examine the phenomenon. And with that, again, I think having met them made a hell of a difference, actually. Having met Diana and Deborah. And Diana was 92, still beautiful. That charm, that Mitford charm, which has a you're slightly wary, very slightly wary. There's something that stops it being saccharine. There's a kind of, and that way they have of talking, which is almost like very, very clever children. You know, they hit the nail on the head in this, I mean, Nancy, that's Nancy's prose style, really. It's to say things that you've never thought that anyone would say, and there they are, and you recognize them, and how wonderful that someone said them. And, but the confidence, I mean, when Diana, you know, she was married to Oswald Mosley, and she just, in between talking about Nancy, she said, well, my husband didn't like Nancy, as if that was a terrible black mark against Nancy. He was a very clever man. You know, she wrote to Deborah, being hated means nothing to me. And because she had this confidence, everyone adored her. I mean, you know, you tried to hold on to your sense of the politics and all that kind of thing. But believe me, in her presence, Karl Marx would have melted. And it must come from confidence. Which is, and that kind of aristocratic, although they were only aristocrats by the skin of their teeth, as even more love telling them, but that sense that if you don't succumb, it doesn't matter, but which means that you probably will succumb. And it's something that I do feel women today, we're so worried about what people think. We're so, you know, this is going to go on YouTube. Oh God, is everyone going to hate me? You know, and once you start thinking like that, you've really screwed. And I just don't think the Mitfords had that in them at all. I mean, Nancy became a regular hate figure because she was a provocateur in her journalism, and obviously the you and non-you thing, when she said, to say, you know, mantelpiece is terribly common, and to say chimneypiece is terribly what people like us do. It's a joke, of course, but you know, she got letters from people wanting to kill her. And I always think of this one said, who do you think you are anyway? And she said, it's so hard to answer, really. And that levity in the face of anything I just have always found rather inspiring. I mean, I first read Nancy when I was about 13, and she has been a bit of a, you know, she's sort of stayed with me, that will to happiness and that blithe confidence in the face of anything. I don't possess it, but if you're in a bad situation, it's quite good to try and summon it up, even in fake form, I think. I suppose it partly comes from their upbringing, from who they were, etc. But I don't, I'm sure there are women who have it today, but I just think we're too assailed today and too self-conscious.
The book has lightness and darkness, and I'm not always convinced that the lightness is the lightness you read, and I think by that I mean the charm of the pursuit of love and that idea, but the darkness is very dark. And is that why we like them? Because they're just such an extreme family?
I think it's partly, again, to do with their attitude towards it, because Diana, you know, she went to Holloway for 3 years because she was married to the chief fascist of Britain, and she spent 3 years in Holloway. And when she came, and she never, you know, she refused to edit her own past. She refused to say that knowing Hitler was anything other than an interesting experience. She did condemn the excesses of the Nazi regime. She did. I know some people say she didn't, but she did. But she just refused to say that that we were wrong to go to war with Germany because it led to the dominance of Russia and the Iron Curtain, etc. And B, that it had been an interesting thing to know these men. So when she came out of Holloway and she was under house arrest and staying at Pam's house, and there were like a mob outside the house, like you'd get today, of journalists and all that kind of thing. And she just wrote in a letter, well, I feel sorrier for them than for us because it's such awful weather. And it's that, and I think she kind of meant it. I think her self-assurance, which is not arrogance and it's not forced. So the extremism of the politics, Unity is a little bit different because poor Unity, well, bad Unity, whatever, who knows, really went, didn't have that attitude because there was obviously something mentally very peculiar about Unity and got very, very deep in, as we know, and shot herself when war was declared, etc. But Diana and Jessica, who, although Jessica hated Diana so much, I regard as rather two sides of the same coin, one a communist and one a fascist. But I think it's their attitude. I think it's the way in which they lived. They did live extremist lives. They didn't just play act, Jessica lost a baby because she was living among the poor in Rotherhithe, which then was very poor. And her baby got measles and died. And so she really did suffer for her principles. And Diana going to jail. But nevertheless, something in them remained, the courage of their convictions and the way in which they dealt with it. I think that's what fascinates us, possibly more than their politics, which most of us are not going to find very appealing. And also, of course, Deborah, her revolutionary behavior was to be very, very sane. And Nancy, of course, her role was to write about it all. And Pamela married a fascist, but didn't seem to sort of notice. I'm sure she did, but you know what I mean? It didn't affect her. So they weren't all extremists. But I'm interested in what you said about the lightness, the Mitford lightness, which Nancy parcels up, as it were, in The Pursuit of Love. What did you mean when you said it's you're not convinced? Because that's really interesting.
I wonder if there is a darkness to Nancy, and I think I do. She's a Mitford I aspire to, but she's also the Mitford that I actually do wonder if did have quite a sad time. She had the great lost love. And I wonder if there's a slightly sad, melancholy side to her.
Yes, but the books are purist.
Yes,
a glad affirmation or whatever. That voice.
That takes me on to an idea. I think the likeness, I wonder, is that joy of self-education. So they always say about children's books that a good children's books, you always get rid of the parents. That's why they're usually orphans, or the parents are off doing something else. And so with the Mitfords, the parents are terribly important to the story, but it's that very light touch parenting, like very light touch education. And there is that wonderful celebration of female cleverness. And for me, that's really enchanting.
Yes, I agree. Of course, Jessica, that was her great thing, that she hadn't gone to school. And Deborah said something like, I went once, didn't see the point, and never went again. Something like that. She said, and there's a marvelous documentary, you don't seem able to find it on YouTube now, but she said, I always think you learn to read and then you do the rest yourself. But I know that's not the fashionable view. But there's something in that. And of course, Diana, when I spoke to Diana, she was, because they had the brother, we always forget Tom. And I think Tom was a big old influence, particularly on Nancy and Diana, because Tom was very clever, kind of almost like an intellectual. And of course, he was being tutored for prep school and Eton subsequently. So the older girls had the benefit of that. I think the family did divide up so that Nancy and Diana they did learn a lot, really. And I think Unity, Jessica and Deborah were cut loose a bit with these not brilliant governesses, you know, fancy playing jiggery pokery. That was go off shoplifting in Oxford or whatever. And I think obviously with them, everything is exaggerated, everything is playing to the gallery. But I think there is a bit of truth in that. And yes, their cleverness. I remember when I went to see Diana, she had Tolstoy sort of just by the tea tray. I mean, why wouldn't you read Tolstoy? But their image is also frivolous, and yet she was trilingual, Diana. I mean, and Nancy, what always touches me so much about Nancy, because like you, I mean, I adore Nancy. When she was dying of cancer, undiagnosed for years, absolute, it's not a tragedy, I don't know what the word is, just this awful end for this wonderful woman. What did she do? She went trudging over Prussian battlefields in order to write a life of Frederick the Great, which always seems to me the most extraordinary thing for this kind of semi-self-taught girl who started off writing Highland Fling when she was 25 because she was pretty and she knew Evelyn Waugh and blah, blah, blah. And then became this, you know, extraordinary. Yeah, I agree. I love their brains. I love the way their minds work. I love the quality of their thought. Like I say, almost that childlike clarity of thought. And you might then say, well, okay, but what about when it came to Oswald Mosley? Yeah, good old sex comes in as well. But of course, what I tried to do with the book was put it in context. And of course, when Diana met Mosley in 1932, Mosley wasn't a pariah at all. He was a much admired politician. And so you have to try and think, what was he like when she met him? A, sexy, must have been, because lots of people, I mean, he had affairs with everyone. And B, politically regarded as a bit of a solution to a terrible state we were in at the time. So, you know, but I mean, her journalism, Diana, is, you might disagree with every conclusion she comes to, but you can't say that her writing isn't superbly cogent, incisive, you know. But it's all slightly for the greater good of Mosley. She had that blind spot. It's amazing.
Is possible the collision of all of the great players of the British 20th century in their lives? You describe a wonderful party in 1928 at the Astors, and you've got Bob Boothby meeting Dorothy Macmillan, you've got Oswald Mosley, you've got everyone almost in one room. I mean, there are lots of people that had a lifespan across the 20th century, but they seem to just mix with everybody. So that anyone who has read a bit of history about the 20th century, in reading about the Mitfords, can put things in context, can come with hindsight, a view, an opinion. Is that part of the charm?
Yes, and absolutely. And I mean, the example that's just popped in my mind is that when Unity was in Munich after the Anschluss, she could write to her cousin Winston Churchill and say, you know, it's really great. And the Austrians are awfully happy because they were related to Churchill and through Clementine, really. But and they I mean, it's not. Sorry, bark. I knew they would, the dogs. I knew they couldn't keep quiet. Yes, they touch, and then obviously because it's a time of, I won't say it can never happen again, although I thought that when I wrote the book, but it's a time of political, you know, extremism that still, to us, looks like a giant chessboard with fascism on one side and communism on the other, or whatever. And because that's why it's unrepeatable. 6 girls like that, bright, beautiful, bursting with personality, bursting with rivalry between each other, imitating Diana, imitating Nancy. They were like the two trailblazers, really. And all this happening when the world is on fire, and them kind of knowing all the major players. Yeah, and America as well. I mean, Deborah was close friends with JFK, and obviously Jessica lived in California and knew, Lyndon Johnson. And I mean, it's to me, it's an unrepeatable set of circumstances, because even if it happened now, you wouldn't again have that same attitude to it that they had. That the fact that they could go through all this when their lives are like soap operas, really, and terrible things happen to them, terrible deaths, terrible miscarriages, hysterectomies, children dying. I mean, just this soap opera. And yet out of it, somehow something remains unworried about them. And to me, it's the anarchic formality, if you like, about them that I think is possibly at the heart of their fascination. When I say in the book, they're revolutionaries who'd been to the hairdresser, and there's their style. They've got this incredible style. I mean, I think, are quite fascinated by that interwar style, and because of them being aristocrats, that untouchable aspect that they've got, and yet they lived lives of an intensity and rawness and sincerity, right or wrong. And I think it's the kind of tension between those two things that to me fascinates me the most. I mean, they do fascinate an awful lot of people, and I suppose there are many, many different reasons why.
I'm glad your naughty dogs barked, because it's made me think of a kind of final question, which is really about you as a writer. I do remember you kind of bursting onto the literary scene with a book about dog racing, because I was in the book trade at the time. And I also remember your book on Newmarket. I mean, I said earlier that you were a fearless writer. You've written very acclaimed books on Agatha Christie, on Nancy Mitford. What makes you go into one of the most crowded kind of biographical waters, which is the Mitfords? And what makes you do that twice?
Yeah, well, I love fearless. That's a great compliment. I really treasure that. So thank you. Nancy was a labor of love. Nancy was kind of the start of the 21st century. And I think Nancy's reputation, I can remember reading some articles when her letters came out and people sort of think, oh, this posh idiot. Oh, God, she thinks she's so funny, blah, blah. Quite snooty, quite taking a feminist stance on her that I thought was rather anti-female, actually. And I kind of, having read her and thought she was a very peculiar kind of artist, genius, I don't know. Nobody can do what she does. I just wanted to write about Nancy as a writer, really. And then, because I met the two surviving sisters, it developed a bit. The Mitfords I was asked to do. I'll be honest, I thought it was a terrible idea. I thought, this is insane. It was after Deborah died, and somebody said, have another look at them, kind of thing. But actually it was a good idea, because of what we were talking about the phenomenon and how they represent so many things that, they'd be torn to shreds for on Twitter today. And yet we can't stop succumbing to them in some way. The creamy English charm, Evelyn Waugh. I just think the phenomenon, I just think that the wheel turns a bit and people start seeing them in another way. And a lot of young women now seem fascinated by that. And I think it must be that, well, it could be anything, but I think the female confidence aspect does fascinate, because we've got everything in the world to be confident about now as women, and yet, I don't know, I just wish we could seize the day a bit more and not worry so much. And that's where they're quite handy to have in one's mind, I think.
Laura, thank you very, very much indeed. I absolutely knew that with you we would get a lot more than just 6 Mitford sisters, however enchanting and amazing that they are. And if you've enjoyed this interview, please tune in to part 2, which is going to be, I'm going to be talking to Laura about her book, The Last Landlady. Thank you, Laura.
Thank you so much.